Buildings, classrooms, laboratories, libraries, and other facilities that facilitate teaching and learning are crucial elements of learning environments in schools. There is strong evidence that high quality infrastructure facilitates better instruction, improves student outcomes, and reduces dropout rates, among other benefits. Students reveal that the design of education infrastructure makes or mar learning for learners. Governments of many countries still use a piecemeal approach to investing in their education infrastructure. In Nigeria's Federal Capital Territory, learning facilities are in questionable forms as the residents of the nation's capital grapple with the realities across public primary and secondary schools in Abuja. The convener of CRISLED, a non-governmental organization, Amsfree Ajanaku, speaks on how subnational governance framework of the FCT affects the public schools in FCT.
Challenge you also face with the FCT is the constitutional architecture of Nigeria, which makes FCT sit as if it's just in the middle of nowhere. What I mean by that is Section 299 of the Constitution says FCT should be treated as if it is one of the states. So the authorities in FCT, for instance, can argue about counterpart funding for basic education because every other state has its quota from UBEC, can access UBEC and have counterpart funding, you know. And now these schools we talk about, these schools are in the communities of the original inhabitants of, Abuja. They are the ones whose children attend the schools. And so if you already marginalize the original inhabitants politically, marginalize them economically, culturally, what you then find out is something as basic as education, they will also be marginalized. They will also not have enough funds to be able to cater for their schools, whether you talk about the maintenance of the schools or building of new schools.
Education is the bedrock for the development of every society. What premium does the Nigerian government place on education? How much is budgeted for? How well are these funds utilized? What quality of teachers, students, and graduates are learning institutions churning out? For answers, join us on Leaves and Worms, an expository and incisive program showing every week on AD4 TV radio and supported by Wale Soyinka Center for Journalism, sponsored by MacArthur Foundation. Don't miss it.
Ajanaku described infrastructure deficit and poor learning facilities on marginalization of the original inhabitants of the FCT.
The marginalization of the Abuja original inhabitant, because we're talking about the FCT, and the analysis you talked about, nature of schools. If you go to the FCC, which is the Federal Capital City, all of these parts where we are in, all these well-paved parts, you see that schools are they are well off. They are well resourced. They have teachers. The school buildings are. But where you have these problems, you talk about dilapidated schools, schools that can pass for dump sites. Where people, you understand, they are in the rural communities. So you have to make that distinction between the urban FCT and the rural areas where the locals, where the original people who have the city live. And that is where you do have schools that are not well resourced. You have schools that are dilapidated. You have teaching that is poor. The teaching outcomes are terrible.
A resident of Jabi area in Abuja Municipal Area Council of the FCT speaks on the current state of public schools.
Going around Abuja today, especially the public schools, you realize that even in the highbrow areas, such as the FCT and Jabi and many other places, you'll be worried. The dilapidated structures housing these pupils, and when you look at it, huge budgets on yearly basis are churned out for the renovation, building, and making infrastructure very conducive. But works are not carried out. Why is it so? It's because people are not doing their job. Go around the FCT, the buildings are collapsing, the roof collapsing, basic facilities, common ones like the blackboard, modern, they are no. So the state of our educational infrastructure is it's not up to it at all. And let us look at even the issue of sporting facilities, recreational facilities. Go around the school, they have all collapsed. For those who have studied education, children's psychology and others, they will tell you sport is a veritable tool for the development of a child. But you see, they allow these things all to rot away. So our schools are not up to it.
Executive Director, Teenage Network, Olanike Timipa Uge, further confirmed the present state of the basic education in Abuja.
So the state of infrastructure in FCT school is very, very appalling. I mean, one will have great expectation for the Federal Capital Territory, of Nigeria, that at least things should be way better than other states. But to our surprise, is the FCT is not in any way different from other states. I mean, in the FCT we have schools where students sit on the bare floor to write. They do not have chairs, they don't have desks to write, and they sit on the bare floor, to copy notes and all of that. That's to tell you how terrible the state of infrastructure is presently in the.
It is no longer news that public schools are in poor states, especially those at the rural areas. But we are also not ignorant of the efforts of government to tackle this. But I think the issue is that most times there is misplaced of priorities. For instance, there are schools that need classroom. Sometimes the government might decide to give them chairs. Sometimes some schools need chairs. The government might decide to build extra classrooms for them. Some infrastructure are at the lowest. In fact, it is very, very weak. Some are not even suited for human beings to stay, not to talk of students to stay and learn.
Ẹ̀kọ́ ní ìpìlẹ̀ ìdàgbàsókè gbogbo àwùjọ. Ipò wo ni àwọn alákòóso FCT gbé ètò ẹ̀kọ́ sí gan? Èló ni owó tí wọ́n yà sọ́tọ̀ fún nínú ètò ìṣúná? Báwo ni wọ́n ṣe ná owó tí wọ́n yà sọ́tọ̀ fún un? Kí ni ìgbéléwọ̀n àwọn akẹ́kọ̀ọ́, olùkọ́ni àti àwọn akẹ́kọ̀ọ́ gboyè tí àwọn ilé ẹ̀kọ́ gíga wa ń pèsè gan? Fún àwọn ìdáhùn lóríṣiríṣi, darapọ̀ mọ́ wa lórí ètò Leaves and Worms, ètò akọ́nilọ́gbọ́n àti ìlanilọ́yẹ tí yóò máa wáyé sí ojú ìwòran yín ní ọ̀sẹ̀ọ̀sẹ̀ lórí ẹ̀rọ móhùnmáwòrán AD4 TV Radio, Wọlé Ṣóyínká Center for Investigative Journalism pẹ̀lú àtìlẹ́yìn MacArthur Foundation ló ṣe onígbọ̀wọ́ rẹ̀. Ẹ má pàdánù rẹ̀ o.
This education expert, Daniel Adejo, identified issues of accountability and failure of supervision on the part of State Universal Basic Education Board in the FCT.
I think primarily is corruption, lack of sincerity, lack of accountability, and also lack of supervision, on the part of the FCT superbs. There's need for strict supervision to ensure that these projects are done according to specification, according to the project design, and also on the part of the community where some of these projects are cited, you observe that the locals, what I mean by the locals, those who are living in that community are not carried along in the project implementation.
What other indices lead to weak infrastructure in these public schools? Again, the executive director of Teenage Network speaks.
So what do I think is responsible for it? Well, I think there are three major things responsible for it. The first one is poor budgeting. Year in, year out, there's been advocacy in regards to increased budgeting for education, and which we've not gotten, satisfying response to over the years. And the second one is the poor culture of maintenance. So even the few infrastructures that used to be in place are poorly maintained. So you go to schools and are getting worn out, there are no replacement, shares desks, get spoiled, and you go to a so-called, computer laboratory, and you see that all the computers there are not functioning because there are no maintenance. The maintenance culture is really bad. Of course, it's the issue of corruption, which is endemic.
For the convener of CRISLED, who has been working on the basic education subsector of the FCT, Arms-Free Ajanaku, corruption is responsible for the present situations of public schools in the FCT.
It's been, one of those issues that has held back the potential of the people for development, and is there in it. We have done work to track the resources that go into sectors like basic education, and you can see that there's a huge deficit and there's a huge gap between resources that have been committed into the process and the outcomes that you have seen. And so that's where the work of civil society comes in as voice actors. So what we encourage communities to do is also to be able to report on some of these things, train them, give them the skills to be able to report on if a school is in your community, a contract is awarded and it has not been done. You have the skills to use things like freedom of information to invoke your rights and ensure that the contractor returns back to site. And then we as civil society, we should be able to amplify those voices. Then we have teeth actors like the anti-corruption agencies, which can then come in to hold contractors accountable. Like the ICPC, for example, does tracking of constituency projects. Some of the constituency projects are actually school projects.
Mrs. Timipa Uge takes this further.
Corruption is a major problem in Nigeria that, everyone that you find in every sector. So it's also a major, issue fueling the weak infrastructure in FCT schools.
Joshua Arogunyo, a social worker in the FCT, speaks to the many dimensions of infraction and lapses that results to weak infrastructure in public schools.
Just understand that corruption is endemic. And corruption is not only stealing. Stealing is not only corruption. I remember one of our former presidents said, stealing is not corruption. He is correct in a sense. People did not get him. So stealing is not only corruption. There are many dimensions of corruption. So that you see the weak infrastructure in basic schools, especially in the FCT. Yes, it could be attributed to signs of corruption. Of course, maybe in the procurement level. At the procurement stage, either the contract were over bloated, or maybe the contractor came and did a substandard job. There are many dimensions of it. What about favoritism in the choice of contractor? All manner. So yes, if you see weak infrastructure in public school, it could be a sign that corruption has taken place and corruption has, is manifesting itself. But on the other hand, that we also see weak infrastructure we cannot also tie that, totally to corruption. Another dimension of it is that maybe this infrastructure has not been renovated, has not been touched, new ones have not been placed. It is actually the old ones that that exist, or maybe nobody has done anything in trying to say, okay, let's replace this. This lab is the lab that the children of in 1993 was first done in 1993, and up till now it has not been rehabilitated. Nothing has been done. Those kind of things could also be responsible for the weak infrastructure we see in basic school. From when was those block of classroom built? So if you go to a school and you see that the roofs are out, maybe that was as a function of that, okay, since it was first built, no repairs, maintenance has been done. So these are also possibilities. We cannot say 100% they may all be corruption, even though we know how endemic corruption has become in our country, but they may not all. It could be just carelessness, lack of maintenance, poor management, of those infrastructure.
Ilimi shine ginshikin ci gaban kowace irin al'umma. Wane irin kima ne hukumar gudanarwa na birnin tarayya ta baiwa ilimi? Kasafin nawa ne aka ware wa bangaren ilimi? Ta yaya ake amfani da waɗannan kuɗaɗen da aka ware wa ilimi? Menene matsayin ingancin malamai da ɗalibai da waɗanda suka kammala manyan makarantu da kuma su kansu makarantun da ake gudanar da harkokin koyo da koyarwa? Domin samun amsoshi, kasance tare da Leaves and Worms a cikin shirin baje koli da faɗakarwa wanda ake gabatarwa a kowane mako a tashar AD4 TV Radio, wanda cibiyar Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism tare da haɗin gwiwar gidauniyar MacArthur Foundation suka ɗauki nauyi. A kasance tare da shirin.
Well, let me say it's because of lack of funds. Most of the schools, if you go across the country, that have been complaining of lack of money to fund most of the basic infrastructure, beginning from the federal government. The budgetary allocation that is being allotted for education sector, first of all, is not enough to address some of the issues. The poor maintenance culture among the schools themselves. Most of the schools, even the few infrastructure that government or some donors have been able to provide for some of these schools, they have a very bad maintenance culture. Most of the time, the fund that is being generated from the schools among themselves are enough to maintain them, but in a process whereby the facilities are already there and the people are not maintaining them, they spoil and it end up contributing a lack of poor infrastructure across the schools.
On the contrary, Arms-Free Ajanaku insists on the use of substandard materials for the construction of the learning facilities.
Of course, we think that if the FCT SUBEB, the FCT Universal Basic Education Board is doing its work, right from because all of these contracts actually have to go through a process of bidding. You understand? Contractors bid, they have bill of quantities. And, it's that bill of quantity that determines the number of cement, number of blocks they use to build the classroom. It's that bill of quantity that specifies the amount of the different building materials that will be put together to build the structure. So if the authorities, which is the FCT Universal Basic Education Board, is doing its due diligence, some of those substandard buildings you talk about will not be built because they will stop the contractors in their track. But because most times you have contractors who are in cahoots with those in authority, so you see them build substandard structures, and then nobody says anything until the structures don't stand the test of time. So what we've always advocated is for communities to be vigilant. Communities should be a part, not just they should be a part of the design process. They should be a part of the awards, process. That what would mean that by that is, okay, when you are doing the bids and all of that, community should be involved for them to say, okay, we have a voice in the process, and we're able to also make recommendations about the kind of. So once community voice is involved, there will be a level of difficulty for anybody to try to rig the process, for any corrupt contractor.
For the challenge of weak infrastructure to be tackled, Ajanakuri states the need to address the peculiar structure of marginalization that faces the Federal Capital Territory.
And like I mentioned earlier, I'll talk about the issue of access. You have several communities in the FCT where children, including girls, trek for 2 hours, in some cases 3 hours, before they can access schools. So even before talking about a school is dilapidating, are there even enough schools to go around the communities? So it's a big problem which would only be solved if the subnational governance framework is well taken care of. What I mean by the subnational governance framework is that other states, they have a state governor and they have a state house of assembly. But in the FCT, you only have a minister who is not elected. The minister is an appointee of the president. So how would a community that does not have a school be able to reach that? The peculiar structure of marginalization that has held the FCT original inhabitants back is what you see playing out in the very high extent of dilapidation you see in their schools. So it's not just school.
These respondents call for the participation of FCT residents in future plans of school buildings, and most crucial, the need for citizens to follow up on school budgeting as well as implementation of major projects across public schools in the Federal Capital Territory.
So therefore, that interest is also a factor that you need to consider. Therefore, going forward, I would like to advise that, for example, now if a SUPEP and UBEC at the national level is embarking on a project, they need to carry the community, they need to carry the locals along. They need to carry the SBMC, that is the School Management Committee. They need to carry them along in project implementation so that interest will be there from the onset. You understand? Therefore, this project will last. It will take years and years and years and all that. So it's a whole lot.
ọmụmụ isi mbido mmepe n'ala ọbụla olee ọkwa ndị ọchịchị Federal Capital Territory Nigeria yọrọ ọmụmụ olee ihe nkwado a na-enye ya kedu otu esi iji nkwado niile ahụ eme ihe ụdị ndị nkụzi ole ụmụ akwụkwọ na ndị gụchara n'akwụkwọ ka ha na-atụpụta n'ebe ọmụmụ ala anyị iji nwetawanye ọsịsa ajụjụ ndị a soronye anyị n'emume Leaves and Worms ebe a na-akọwapụta ma kọwamie ihe n'izu ụka ọbụla na mgbakọ ndị AD4 TV Radio nke onye ọkammụta Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism ma nwekwa nkwado ndị otu MacArthur Foundation. Ohere a agafekwala gị.
Why it is important, for civil society organizations, not just civil society organizations, but for Nigerians, in general, to step up our game when it comes to accountability. We need to start, holding decision makers accountable for all the electoral promises, and for, we need to start tracking the budget. What amount of money has been allocated to education? Who is in charge? What is supposed to be done, and what is the required time frame? We need to start following up all of those information.
Well, I cannot say I have an evidence, but corruption is a general problem that we're facing into this country. So you cannot put corruption aside the issue that is on hand, because most of the school, the income that is being generated from the school among themselves is enough, if well handled, to take care of some of the challenges that you have just raised. But corruption in some of the schools that have been affecting them, I think, is one of the factors that has been contributing to this.
So for government to be able to tackle this, they have to actually come down and go to these schools, especially the ones at the rural area, and get to know really what their challenge is, and then provide them with what these challenges, and provide them with things that will solve these challenges. So for me, I think one of the biggest things that the government should do is that to make sure that the state of the infrastructures are in good shape, one, and then two, provide adequate teachers for the right subjects, because most times you see one teacher taking more than 4 to 5 classrooms, which is not, you don't even expect the quality to be strong. You find out some students in primary 6, they can't even tell you their name in English. So government need to just come down to this level and then get things right, do the right thing, provide the right resources that each school needs. It's not by, okay, we want to give this allocation, you just give allocation. They don't even go back to monitor if those things get to the schools. Sometimes you get to a schools, you see infrastructures that have been built but was not handed over to the schools until the thing will just go down again. So these are so many challenges in the system that the government need to really sit up to look at.
This report was produced by Voice of Nigeria in collaboration with AD4 TV Radio and supports from MacArthur Foundation and the Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative
Journalism.